Welcome to Massey College, and my name is Jonathan Rose. I am the acting principal of Massey College, and this is a dialogue on AI harms. Is it a social good or a social harm? I'd like to begin by acknowledging the land on which we're having this dialogue. Massey College is built on land where many Indigenous peoples have lived. It is on the treaty lands and territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, as well as the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Haudenosaunee peoples. We want to acknowledge our duty of stewardship towards this land and the great privilege that we have to work on this land. This dialogue is one that's the closest to my own personal field, and so in discussing it with Irina and Alyssa and others, I actually had a chance to have some input, whereas there are many dialogues here that really don't touch my field at all. And I just want to say that I think I live in this exact world in my own research, and I attempt to bring modern AI, modern large language models, on the task of helping in the mental health and addiction space. And I believe that there's a great future where we will have access to mental health talk therapy anytime, anywhere it's needed. And I think that's one of the social goods that's going to be talked about. But I absolutely understand the other side of this question. It is an incredibly powerful thing, and it can be used by bad actors to do terribly bad things. And so we're about to launch, and we are in a world where all this happens. So I just wanted to put my own 2 cents in, although I'm just mostly going to listen today. I'd like to introduce our 2 panelists. Kashar Mahetaji, to my right here, is a PhD student in the information, in the iSchool, the Faculty of Information. She completed her Master of Information at U of T and her Bachelor of Science in the Integrated Sciences program at McMaster University. Her research brings together media studies, business studies, and information systems to understand how software changes affect creators on social media platforms. She is keen to investigate the longer lineage of AI tools and how they shape creative work and the cultural content consumed on TikTok. Our second moderator is Irina Moon. She's a first-year PhD student also in the Faculty of Information here at U of T. Her research is within the interdisciplinary area of human-centered data science, where she combines technical methodologies with interpretive methods to study the intersection between data science, public policy, and human-computer interaction. She is particularly interested in how algorithmic decisions-making models are designed and implemented to mitigate structural inequalities within homelessness in North America. Prior to her PhD, she received a Master of Information from U of T, a BA in Economics from the University of Chicago, and worked in finance and education. Over to you 2.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jonathan, for the introductions. So first and foremost, it's a privilege to be able to share the stage with our panelists, Dr. Shayan Guha, as well as Dr. Jesse Hall, along with my co-moderator, Irina Moon, all of whom are incredibly well-versed in the topic at the heart of today's Massey Dialogue, a timely topic that's the top of mind across societal sectors, across industries, and across institutions. It's a topic that has considerable consequences for how we live as societies, as workers, as learners, as innovators, as citizens, and as individuals. We can go as far as to say that our topic today, artificial intelligence, or AI, has profound implications for what it means to be human. So before turning to our panelists, I want to briefly describe the queries and the quandaries that form the crux of our panel. Our session this afternoon, as Jonathan mentioned, is titled AI Infiltrating Our Daily Lives. So just for a minute, let's concentrate on the term infiltrate. Often, when we speak of infiltration, we're suggesting that we're securing entry and we're gaining access to guarded information. The popularization of AI and the adoption of AI has sparked fears that AI has infiltrated or has gained access to knowledge, wisdom, and experience thought to be limited, unique, and circumscribed to humans. From the Hollywood screenwriters protesting generative AI in the entertainment industry during the 2023 Writers Guild of America strike, to educators that are scrambling to manage AI across Ontario education systems and in Ontario classrooms. The rapid spread of AI for many has felt like, and still continues to feel like, infiltration. Infiltration that compels us to reconceptualize how we see our spaces, our time, as well as ourselves. This brings me to the subtitle of today's talk: a social good or potential harm. You'll notice that in place of a statement, we offer a question. When the technology firm OpenAI released its generative AI-based chatbot, ChatGPT, in 2022, it brought AI to the forefront of public discourse, and at the same time, it inspired both utopian and dystopian visions for human and technology collaboration. How we define AI, how we use and govern AI, and how we evolve alongside AI are all questions that require deep and sustained engagement. And how we balance AI for good and improve societal outcomes too requires deep discussion. In climate science, for instance, AI improves efficiency and accuracy of climate models, but at the same time, it can be energy intensive. In education, AI can be used as a study partner for active recall and personalized learning, but at the same time, it can pen papers that supplant the learning process. So how we develop, deploy, and manage AI is both contextual and relational, and involves weighing the positives and the negatives. So before I turn to our panelists, I want to briefly conclude with a few quotes from our 2024 Nobel Prize winner and University of Toronto professor, Geoffrey Hinton, who's often referred to as the godfather of AI. In speaking about the positives, Professor Hinton remarks, "I'm hoping AI will lead to tremendous benefits, to tremendous increases in productivity and a better life for everybody." In the same discussion, he emphasizes, "My worry is that it may also lead to bad things, and in particular, when we get things more intelligent than ourselves, no one really knows whether we're able to control them." Managing these advantages and disadvantages, according to Professor Hinton, involves more research. Discussions such as the one today will provide a platform to engage with and contribute to this research. So today, I have the tremendous honor of introducing our highly accomplished AI scholars who are shaping this research and who are both based at the University of Toronto. Professor Shayan Guha is an assistant professor in the Faculty of Information and cross-appointed to the Department of Computer Science at the University of Toronto. His research interests include human-computer interaction, data science, and public policy. He's been involved in developing the field of human-centered data science. And this intersectional research area combines technical methodologies with interpretive inquiry to address biases and structural inequalities in socio-technical systems. He's the author of Human-Centered Data Science: An Introduction, an Amazon best-selling textbook published by MIT Press in 2022. Shayan wants to understand how algorithmic decision-making processes are designed, implemented, and evaluated in public welfare and other types of services. In doing so, he often works with marginalized and vulnerable populations, such as child welfare, homelessness, healthcare systems, and etc. His work has been supported by grants from the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, the National Science and Engineering Research Council, the National Science Foundation, the American Political Science Association as well. He's been featured in the media, including Newsweek, Associated Press, ACLU, ABC, NBC, and Gizmodo. Shayan has been awarded a Wakefinger Early Career Award in 2019, a Knott New Researcher Award in 2021, and a Schwartz-Reisman Institute for Technology and Society Faculty Fellowship from 2023 to 2025. Previously, he received a Master's of Science from the Indian Statistical Institute in 2010 and a PhD from Cornell University in 2016. And along with Professor Shayan Guha, we have Dr. Jessie Hall, who's a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute for the History and Philosophy of Science and Technology at the University of Toronto. Her research is concentrated in what is most aptly described as the philosophy of computing, situated at the intersection of philosophy of mathematics, philosophy of language, and the philosophy of science. Her research focuses on what it means to call a system computational, tracing the influences of mathematical, Turing and others, computability, functionalism, and various stripes of reductionism on conceptions of physical computational systems. Think about brains as computing systems and abstract computing. As part of her postdoctoral research, Jessie is working with Professor Karina Vold on projects that investigate the intersections of technology and society, continuing work started as a Schwartz-Reisman Graduate Fellow in 2021 and 2022. I'd like to thank both of you so much for coming to our panel today.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, no worries. And just to get us started, the first question that Irina and I have today is, and what I think is at the heart of a lot of questions, is how do we define AI? Maybe we can start with Jessie.
Sure. This is actually a great question because it's one that I have that like bothers me actually, and that I once wrote a probably bad abstract for a talk because I think that the referent of this term is actually quite unclear. On the one hand, there's the sort of like ostensive definition that we can offer, right? I think right now we would say that most of what we call AI is something that has at its heart a machine learning architecture, but that hasn't always been the case. Lots of things way farther back in history have been referred to as AI that now I think would be the sort of canonical examples of what we think is just not AI, that by contrast, like the general problem solver, if anybody has heard of this, of Newell and Simon, the architecture seems to be the thing that people use to distinguish it as no longer the thing that we're referring to when we're talking about AI, because it has this propositional, logic-based, every rule is explicitly represented architecture to it. So this is to say that the referent of the term AI has definitely changed over time, and it seems like what we are referring to in general when we talk about AI now is machine learning, and especially in this moment, I would say a lot of people, when they hear the word AI, are just thinking about large language models. Now there are other applications that are maybe on the periphery as well, like deepfake stuff, image generation, and that kind of thing. But I've had some thoughts about this, and I wonder if one of the sort of prevailing intuitions that guides our sort of like use of this term now is the degree to which the systems resemble people, not in the way that they behave, but in our access to what causes what they're doing. So when we look at the older systems and we're looking at this explicit propositional logical architecture, we can see the reasoning that leads to the output, right? Whereas I have the suspicion that maybe what we call the intelligence, the artificial intelligence now, are the things where we can't see the chain of reasoning or the sort of like rules or representations that were involved in the behavioral output in question. So I suppose the short answer is I don't know what we mean by AI. I wish we would get a little bit clearer on that. We can sort of like point to these habits that we have, but I wonder if these are sort of robust boundaries that we can point to consistently from moment to moment and from case to case. So.
No, that's really helpful, Jessie. Thank you, especially thinking about the longer historical lineage and how our perceptions and definitions of AI have evolved over time, and so what kind of definition we can operationalize. I think we'll get more into that in a little bit, but before I do that, I was thinking, Cheyenne, if what your understanding or definition of AI would be.
Perhaps I might come at it from a recent set of events that I found myself embroiled in. So I'm on a couple of government subcommittees in both Canada and the United States. As some of you may know, Canadian federal government right now is debating Bill C-27, or the AI Data Act, ADA. it's under vigorous debate. There's all kinds of committee readings and subcommittee kind of discussions going on. And a few months ago, they came under severe criticism because they were seeking feedback from the common citizens. And it turns out that the committee that they had identified for the sake of, who common citizens are essentially representatives. This is all public knowledge. This is representatives of your big banks and telecom and, grocers, Loblaws, basically, right? It's all public information. So after some critique, they said, okay, fine, we need to involve some faculty, some academics, some researchers, some civil society kind of activists from organizations like the CCLA, so on and so forth. And so, they brought us together and, we were debating some of the text of ADA, it's Bill C-27. Bill C-27 starts out with like an entire introduction on what is AI. And it turns out that that committee could not agree on what is AI at all. In fact, the Word document kind of looked like, the worst set of edits and updates and rollbacks and changes and comments, and nobody could really, really agree on what AI actually is. And so, as we soon realized, as Jesse astutely pointed out, some of the committee members came at it from the point of large language models and generative AI. Like, that is AI. AI is nothing but LLMs and other kinds of generative models. And some other folks came at it from, no, any software system that does some kind of algorithmic imposition and decision making is AI. And so it seems to me that this debate is not settled, and we have drawn somewhat of a vague and large boundary around AI, but I think that we're going to run into all kinds of disagreements were we to put more kind of like settled debates kind of questions on it. I don't think that's there yet. So perhaps we have failed to answer your question.
Yeah, I think it's really great to highlight that there's so many discrepancies and the different even subject discipline differences, even just here on this panel, or even thinking about industry, civil society. So our other question does sort of relate, and it's more so connected to the idea that how did we collectively come to understand AI, just in terms of public discourse, so thinking outside the academic sphere, and then even generally just within your own personal disciplines, how you came to that, your personal understanding of AI. Maybe this time we can start with Shayan, if that's okay.
I'll take a stab. So my work in the last decade has centered around the public sector adoption of AI, how AI is used within the public sector, within departments and agencies in the public sector. And I've studied quite a few adoptions of AI in different departments in both the US and Canada. There's different imaginations of what that AI kind of evolution looks like. When I was studying the child welfare system in the US state of Wisconsin, which I'd been studying for about 7 years at this point, they didn't really have AI as we might imagine. They didn't really have a software where you pushed a button and some kind of a predictive result pops out, whether that's a classification model with some idea of high, medium, low risk or whatever. None of that was really there. What they did have were paper risk assessments that have been used for a long time that was then computerized. So essentially, psychometric risk assessments have been used for a long time in child welfare systems to determine things like mental health needs assessments of children, or to do things such as predict neglect or abuse of a particular child within the system. But what the employees of that particular agency called AI was not AI as we would imagine. It was merely those same risk assessments that was then packaged up into a software. So instead of a paper risk assessment where individual caseworkers would tick boxes, they now carried around iPads and they filled in little boxes and pressed a button, and some risk score would pop out. But it wasn't necessarily based on any kind of a training of prior data. It was just based on the specific responses based on a rubric, a score rubric attached to it. But that was AI to them. So, would we be at fault to then go and say that, no, this is not AI, because they think it's AI? On the other hand, very recently, on the other end of the scale, I was recently asked to contribute to, this is going to sound ridiculous, the city of Toronto clearly has a housing homelessness problem. We all know this. And we know that a lot of homelessness housing issues are caused due to structural issues in society. But of course, instead of dealing with hard structural issues, we want to have some kind of predictive model solutions to this. Except the city of Toronto doesn't have any kind of AI solution to fix homelessness, but they want to. And so they reached out to me and they said, can you help us write a description of what this hypothetical AI system or software might look like, so that then we can put this into a public tender, and then we can solicit third-party private companies to come and build an AI system? So the question is, their idea of AI was completely different than our friends in Wisconsin in the Child Welfare Agency version of AI. On the other hand, and this is the last example I will give, I'm currently working with another graduate student on the relationship between public higher education in Canada. So U of T technically is public higher education, but I'm talking about the college system. So Conestoga, Centennial, Humber, so on and so forth. And I'm sure every day we wake up in the newspaper and the newspaper headlines are something like, immigration restrictions issued against student permits because we have way too many students, and the students are the main reason of our housing issues because of unscrupulous landlords, and it's because of too many international students that nobody can find jobs, entry-level jobs in Ontario. Well, most of these public colleges actually use what we would call AI models from a pretty computational perspective to make decisions about which students to admit or not, because they have a lot of applications coming in and they have a lot of training data from past, however many decades worth of data, and they have specific kind of targets to meet with respect to. They have this detailed calculation about domestic student tuition and international student tuition. At the end of the day, it's about filling up budgets. And so they have, like a really nice optimization algorithm that outputs like a predictive kind of answer. And oftentimes the admissions team depends on whatever the probability value is given to them. So these are three different kind of like public sector examples, and they have three completely different ideas of what AI is, or how even the evolution of AI has kind of crept into these kind of domains. So, to go back to kind of the broader question that you asked and today's theme, AI has certainly kind of found its way or infiltrated into these kinds of systems in a variety of ways. And even in the case of the city of Toronto, they may not have AI right now, but they certainly want AI. But what that AI looks like, that's up to, a lot of different factors. We don't know. So often I like to tell my students that technology acquisition is actually the really interesting part of research. Once AI is imposed, sure, we can, kind of analyze and figure out all kinds of biases and other things that are wrong with it. But the way that AI comes into a workplace and how it starts changing how people imagine and view the outcomes of AI, and how that changes their existing work practices or even embeds into their existing work practices, that is really the really, really interesting thing to know, because it changes the fundamental relationship that people have with AI systems. And this is kind of like a more kind of on-your-face egregious example, but you can think of less obvious examples, like, for instance, content moderation on Twitter or Reddit or TikTok or whatever. I don't have social media, so I don't care. But or like Netflix recommendation, although those are less high-risk decision-making areas. All right, I'll stop here.
Yeah, so as a philosopher, I'm typically very comfortable with not having any answers to things. So when I confront the fact that it seems there are no necessary and sufficient conditions for being AI, I just sort of shrug my shoulders and say, okay. But I think that it's an interesting exercise to try to do this. And this is something that I sometimes pose to my students. Way back, I think it was the 1970s. I knew the exact year at one point. Now it's just lost from my mind. But there was a proposal, the Dartmouth proposal, to create an artificial intelligence in one summer. It was proposed by Marvin Minsky and Claude Shannon and a few other people. They were going to spend one summer, and they were going to build a machine that was going to be able to do, and this is the key part, whatever a human being can do that was sort of in the realm of what we consider intelligent behavior. So they were going to build artificial intelligence, and it was going to be intelligent, being able to do whatever a human being can do. Now that's not very specific. And there are lots of things that in narrow domains can already do things better than we can, right? Lots of us rely on calculators and various other things. And so there's kind of like this historical benchmark that I think still cuts through as like a maybe an essential aspect, even if it's not like the like full story of what AI is, which is that something that humans do is offloaded onto a different system. So that first example you gave, right? You might be calling it AI because what was once checked off by a person is now done by an algorithm or whatever. The other thing about being a philosopher is that we like to just like do this process of analysis, like break things down, see if we can't come up with some necessary and sufficient conditions, whatever, and think about the component parts of a particular term. And so we have artificial intelligence, and we have this term intelligence, which is kind of like the operating piece of the term. And this is probably the other troubling part about coming up with a referent for AI, which is that we don't really know what intelligence is. We don't really know what we mean by that. We don't even know necessarily what sort of the mode of the question is, right? Like, what are the physical facts that need to be instantiated such that we would say something is intelligent? Or what is the suite of behaviors that something should have such that we would say it's intelligent? We don't have any consensus on that, and our intuitions are all over the place and often conflicting. One thing I would say is that the thing that has been very impressive to philosophers about the stuff that we now call AI is that it has solved certain, or not necessarily solved, but has performed insanely better at certain sort of classic tests for intelligence in philosophy. So large language models in particular have evinced a capacity to do things that used to be beyond the reach of like classic systems. So being able to understand context, being able to understand ambiguous pronouns and ambiguous subjects within a sentence. There are these exemplar sentences called Winograd schema sentences, where the sentence would have a single word changed. So one of the examples is, the city council denied the protesters a permit because they feared violence. And then the coupled sentence is, the city councilors denied the protesters a permit because they threatened violence. Now there's only one word changed, threatened versus feared, and classic systems could not figure out who they referred to in each of the sentences. But now, when you try to get ChatGPT to do this or Copilot to do this, they tend to do a lot better. And in general, they tend to pass the Turing test, which is that if you didn't know any better, you might suspect that you were speaking to a person. So that's kind of just like a lot of rambling intuitions about the question. But I mean, the initial question was, how did we come to sort of terms with a notion of AI for our research? And I would say that the short answer is I haven't, but I think that that's interesting. And I'm okay to just settle there.
Yeah, I think both cases are really helpful and give us a lot of tangible and concrete examples, even when thinking about the differences in the word, the 3 different case scenarios and case studies as to how differently individuals and groups and stakeholders define AI. Something that has come up in both of your conversations is this idea of also thinking about algorithms and recommendation systems and some of these technologies that we publicly and even across disciplines have had more time to engage with. Is there anything you see from those earlier technologies, specifically thinking about recommendation systems or algorithms, that we can apply to how we approach AI? Or is there something immediately novel? And I think, Jesse, you really hint at this when you talk about, for example, being able to solve classical problems that previously we couldn't solve. But is there any differentiating factor or specific caution we should be taking? Or can we approach AI similarly to how we've approached algorithms, just computerization, digitization? And do you want to get started, Jesse?
Sure. Yeah. So actually, I mean, I think that there are certain differences that we can easily point to, like simply the compute power that is involved in like an LLM or an image generator is like well beyond a recommendation algorithm. But I actually think that these comparisons are sometimes instructive for the ways that they're similar, actually, particularly when we're worried about questions about social goods and social harms. So, one of the things that I ask myself all the time when I'm thinking about sort of like the broad space of AI ethics and about the sort of like hopes and fears of AI, particularly the fears, is what are we actually afraid of? And I think that especially when it comes to like questions about privacy or questions about manipulation or questions about misinformation, the differences between our state of affairs when we just had recommendation algorithms and so on, and the state of affairs when we have LLMs, some of the things that we are most afraid of are actually not too different between those two algorithmic technologies, we'll say. I mean, there are additional things that maybe we should worry about in the generative and LLM cases, but one thing that people are worried about with respect to misinformation might be like deep fakes or in particular being manipulated, right? Being shown like a selective amount of information that might influence your thinking in a certain way. For example, it was somebody at the Monk School, and I forget his name, but he went viral because he probed ChatGPT about philosophers. Name 10 philosophers. They were all men. They were all Western. Why did you name only men? Oh, sorry, here's a list of women. Why did you name only Western philosophers? It was a list of all Western philosophers. Oh, here are some non-Western philosophers, and the list wasn't even philosophers anymore. It was just like random notable women from not the West. And the point was to show how the LLM sort of like in an underhanded way influences what we end up knowing and what we end up thinking, what we end up believing about who is a philosopher and so on. And I think drawing the comparison with the technologies that we were worried about 10 years ago or whatever, especially the example of recommendation algorithms, is in that respect, the differences are not so great, that there's still this kind of the same sort of mode of the problem, right? The selective information. And so I think the maybe more general answer is that making these comparisons can be really productive, irrespective of whether we think they are that different or not, in terms of getting at specifying what we might be worried about, or what might be sort of like the origins of our ethical concerns.
Thank you. That was very insightful. And I wanted to go a little bit deeper into some of the topics that we've come up with and sort of go into sort of the AI harms that Jesse briefly mentioned. Maybe we can sort of think about how these AI harms can manifest themselves within different contexts, because as Cheyenne sort of provided examples of, there are various use cases of AI, albeit AI and its definition is very debated. And I would imagine the harms that arise from these AI models can be very different across different domains, and it could have different implications for the sort of population group that are being affected. So I just wanted to ask, what are your thoughts, Jesse, on just going into something more specific, the role of LLMs, for example, maybe, or ChatGPT. We've seen a lot of media coverage over it, and I think you probably experienced this as well, but a lot of students are using it as well. And what do you think of the social harms or maybe the benefits of certain technologies like this?
Yeah, so I definitely have experienced this firsthand. I've been teaching for a couple semesters now, a 100-level course, where I feel like this is the place where I see it the most, where students use LLMs to generate their essays. And it's actually usually pretty obvious. There's still lots of problems with hallucinations, as they're called, right? So if you prompt an LLM a certain way, if you ask it to give you citations, it might make them up. And so this is a harm in the sense that when you are a teacher, you are, and I'm sure a lot of people probably are familiar with this, you're trying to meet certain objectives, right? Certain learning objectives, and you design your assignments to try to probe those skills, to bring about those skills. And when students just use an LLM to do their assignment, right, they're offloading that cognitive task. And I mean, I think that it's a messy space to try to parse out where we should, where our worry is warranted and where it's not, because I'm cognizant of all of these examples going back to ancient history, right, where people in positions of teaching have bemoaned the latest technology, even when it was paper, bemoaning not remembering something and offloading that cognitive task onto a piece of paper, right? And so on the one hand, I say to myself, well, maybe this cognitive offloading is not so bad. Maybe I'm just being Socrates, wringing my hands about paper or something. Well, that temporally doesn't make any sense, but you know what I mean. And there have been some philosophers who've also written about the sort of positive side of this. David Chalmers comes to mind. He wrote a book about virtual reality, and he, at some point in that book, argues that this cognitive offloading is good because it gives us space to sort of put that cognitive energy towards something else that will be even better. And I think that's great, but it's not guaranteed. I would like more reasons to have some optimism than just looking at the past. I mean, these inductive arguments are fair enough, but I think it is equally a concern that people forget to do things that are essential, or that students at least don't learn where they ought to skills that are essential, such as reasoning. And so, yeah, I suppose the short answer is that I'm of two minds. On the one hand, I can see the sort of optimism that this cognitive offloading could give us space to do other things. At the same time, the cognitive skill that you are offloading is something I want you to do as a teacher. And if you're not doing it, I don't know what the result of that might be if in a decade nobody is doing that cognitive task anymore. That's an empirical question that time will tell.
Yeah, that's true. I think I'm using a lot more ChatGPT as well in my work, just when I'm writing up cover letters to just get the different formats and to just get a head start. And I often see it when, I'm grading student assignments when they're programming as well, because I think they run it through ChatGPT. So, Shayan, I was wondering if you had any thoughts on this topic.
I'll provide a pessimistic example, and then I'll provide an optimistic example. The pessimistic example, I don't think many of you have thought about this, but I'm sure that there are people in this room who have in the past or are currently or are considering using dating apps. Tinder, Bumble, Hinge, you know what I'm talking about. Recently, there was a fantastic series of research that was done using, so I'm not sure if folks know this, but most of the dating apps are owned by two companies. So even though there's a dating app, Bumble and Tinder, and they ostensibly are geared towards two different audiences, they're actually owned by the same Match.com company, which also owns Match.com, which is a dating website. Anyway, that's a different ecosystem, but essentially these researchers did some research to figure out that the recommendations that, these dating apps always say that our AI is the best AI, and it gives you the best possible recommendations so that you can find your partner, somebody you want to date. And so clearly they're giving you AI recommendations. Well, it turns out that people actually have been, now we've have over a decade of dating profiles and histories. So researchers actually figured out that dating apps have actually resulted in very efficient social sorting as opposed to diverse mixing. So what happens is, essentially, even in a very diverse area like Toronto or New York City, when you go on dating apps, you basically pretty much end up with people from the same background that you have. So white people end up dating other white people, black people end up dating other black people, South Asian people end up dating other South Asian people. And there's actually less diversity in terms of mixing with people. Oftentimes that is not considered a good thing for the evolution of society. So that's actually a thing that people have studied. With a commentary, the provocative kind of takeaway from that set of research was, are dating apps purifying our, DNA pool? It was something like that. Now that's a very weird, bleak example, but it's something that people have been studying. The more positive example that I've seen, and this is once again in the research that I do in the public sector, there's actually a very, very optimistic use case for specifically large language models. That sounds weird, right? Well, in the public sector, especially in social welfare, what the huge problem that a lot of social welfare kind of caseworkers face is that they need to have constant communication with their clients. And essentially what happens is the ratio between social workers to the number of clients, it just keeps increasing. So every year, one social worker will have 100, 150, 200 clients, and just keeps going up because governments don't hire that many people, but society has needs. So a lot of the time, social workers actually spend in trying to do things like emails, check-ins, figuring out if they've submitted the right form, right information, like touch bases, are 80% of the things that social workers actually do. There's a huge positive, optimistic use case of things like large language models actually taking away some of that grunt work that they have to do, but that's actually kind of a waste of a trained, licensed social worker's capabilities. There's a huge use case of this. And right now, some colleagues in the States are actually working with, this is in the state of Colorado, they're actually working with their child welfare department to figure out if they can actually implement such an AI tool that can reduce the burden of some of this. So what might be optimistic for us to note here is that whilst things like large language models are not going to inherently change the way that social work is done, it can help reduce a lot of the burdens, a lot of the cognitive load that individual social workers have to face. One of the huge issues in social work is that there's social worker burnout. The median time post a master's in social work for one job is 18 months. People get burned out. Within 18 months, they'll leave. They'll go somewhere else. They'll go to even another job with like lower salary. Even though MSWs don't pay that much, they'll go to another job with lower salary because it's too much. And it's not the inherent trauma of dealing with neglected and abused kids. That they're trained for. The inherent trauma is the 50,000 forms and touch bases and things that keep getting added to their pile. So they can't close off a case very easily. Now the question is, can AI tools like large language models help in that space? And I think that there is this really interesting use case, especially in public sector adoption of AI, that we need to study. We don't know. I think it would be premature for us to just be Luddites and claim that it'll never work, inherently it's biased. I think this is one of the cases that could actually have a very, very good positive case. See, what we tried to do with the public sector was we tried to predict people. We tried to boil people down to numbers and make decisions about their lives based on AI recommendations. And that has proven to be a really, really bad strategy. We can't really do that. But can we do the other things around? Like, can we let people take care of other people but reduce the inherent cognitive load that people have in taking care of other people? That is the thing that I'm very optimistic about.
So it's good to hear that there are some positives and some potential harms that we're facing. So now that we're nearing the end of our session, I wanted to turn to the floor here and ask if there are any questions for our panelists. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm Kursat Ural. I'm working here. Just my question is very short. Which jobs will be destroyed the AI the first?
Which jobs will be? Yeah.
Which jobs?
That's a good question. I mean, I think it's a thing that a lot of ink has been spilled worrying about. I remember reading a headline somewhere that talked about how, you know, this generation of AI is going to automate all the white-collar jobs. And I think that is like somewhat coming to fruition already. I mean, if you wrote copy for a job, you're quickly facing replacement by LLMs. But then this sort of also introduces like a separate worry about policy choices and stuff, because I mean the other big example that I can think of is legal write-ups, like writing drafts of a whole bunch of stuff, including decisions, right? There have been cases where really important stuff has been written by an LLM instead of by a legal representative of some sort, a judge or a lawyer or whatever. So I think it's just sort of like a question we have to wait and see, right? What jobs will be replaced, but then it is immediate that we should also worry about what will happen if and when some of those jobs are replaced, because I think that we have lots of outstanding worries with the regulation of these systems as we gleefully embrace them to replace human workers in a variety of places. So, yeah.
I think I can respond a little bit, add to what you just said. I mean, in academia, we have this discussion all the time. At least in the iSchool, there's a lot of consternation about whether or not the university can take the content of faculty, lectures in terms of slides and video lectures that are already recorded on Quarkus, and then like package, can like an AI bot run like an asynchronous virtual course, right? I think it's more nuanced than that, but certainly some of my colleagues are very concerned that the teaching profession is in dire peril of being replaced. At least instruction in the classroom with respect to introductory courses can be replaced. I don't know if that's true or not, but it certainly seems to be a huge fear that a lot of people have.
So I have two questions, I think, for both speakers. So the first one is, I know you mentioned that, replacing a certain type of cognitive load can be desirable. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but let's take from a healthcare specific context. A lot of clinicians, often physicians specifically, early on in their resident training, they are taught to write clinical notes, and they're taught to really understand how to write an effective clinical note. It's part of their training, right? Because it helps them think critically about a clinical presentation and then distill that information into something that's concise and relevant that other physicians are supposed to look at and then get an understanding of a patient's case. And especially when you're doing stuff like handover, right? How to distill the relevant case facts versus non-relevant ones, it's extremely important. I could see clinical note summarization, which is something that LLMs have demonstrated success in doing, being very useful for established older physicians. But do you not think that this is a critical gap in an early physician's career training to not be given the same opportunity to build that competency if they're already being replaced or asked to not do that? And does that mean that you're going to see different modes of specialties, or the way that specialties are trained, for example, primary care, evolve differently? And then my second question is, you mentioned a potential benefit of using generative AI or large language models using the social worker example. And I do agree that a lot of established social workers may feel that going through these burdensome processes of filling so many forms out, et cetera, can be, troublesome. But it also walks them through the process of seeing the type of healthcare system that they operate and exist in. And a lot of the disparities or the reasons why people have exacerbating social work needed issues is because they're facing an inefficient system. Going through that process of filling out 100 different forms for different things helps the social worker gain a better appreciation of the system that they're working within, and to maybe even help begin to navigate and translate some of those learnings over to the patients or the people that they're seeing. And it almost seems like LLMs, the way that these use cases and benefits are almost like a Band-Aid solution, rather than really honing in on the bigger concerning issue is, why are we operating in a system that requires 300 forms to be filled out for a specific condition? So sorry for the lengthy points, but I would like to hear your thoughts about that.
Do you want to go first? Okay. I feel like I'm more appropriately poised to answer the first question. And the simple answer is, like my personal feeling, which is not necessarily that important, is that there is something lost if you don't practice that cognitive skill, if the cognitive skill is part of what your job is, right? So when I mentioned at the beginning, like asking this question, what is it we're afraid of? That's what we need to ask ourselves when we look at offloading that task to an automated system, right? Is to say, what could potentially be lost that we might have not wanted to lose by offloading that task? And I think you have sort of like posited a potential risk there, right? That maybe some of the physicians who never go through this process will fail to acquire certain like endemic skills when receiving a load of information about a patient, to synthesize and to maybe point towards a diagnosis or whatever, right? Yeah, I mean, all I can say is, yeah, I think that's the task that we need to be constantly doing. In fact, before we start deploying these things into real settings, right? Because what if that skill is something that is terrifically essential, and that the downstream consequences are people die that shouldn't have, you know? So yeah, I think your intuitions are good here, and this is perhaps another instantiation of the way that our thinking about the ethical issues is playing catch up with the deployment of these things. Yeah.
Shayan, do you want to add anything?
Sure. I'll just say very quickly that with respect to the social work question, I deal in band-aids. The obvious solution is very clear. Hire more social workers and have more funding in the system. But clearly that's not happening unless our very system of governments change. No government, however progressive, is actually going to reduce those ratios, because that would involve a lot of other political considerations that they're not willing to consider at all. So, you know, I live in a world where I'm neither super technologically positivist that here's a solution and that solution will fundamentally change society, nor do I live in a world where, you know, it's kind of like let's burn everything down because clearly we don't have the right solution to the right problem. I'm always in a world where it's like, what can I do to fix this particular thing this particular year? So I totally see where you're coming from, but it's what the current impacted stakeholders as the system want right now. They're bothered with how to help the child right now. They're not bothered with like what might happen in 3 years. That's a 36-month later question. So it's a difference of philosophy.
So I think we have an online question, which we can get to right now. I'll read it out. There are researchers that define AI as a system which helps them identify various categories of interpersonal, labor, environmental, and etc. harms. How concerned should we be about environmental harms, do you think?
Well, this is farther afield from my area of expertise. One thing that is obvious is that the compute required to run some of these like top of the line, really impressive systems, LLMs being our most sort of like prevalent example, but also the generative AI that are translating natural language into images and stuff, is so well beyond any of the things that we've interacted with before, and that's very out of view. That most people who go onto ChatGPT have no idea the environmental impact, the energy requirements of answering a question that you could have queried on Google, but using ChatGPT to do it. And I think that, I mean, there's a bunch of concerns that range from just like, the gamut of worries that we have about needlessly using energy-intensive technologies. But I think one microcosm that we can at least talk about right now is this fact that it's so out of view, right? That the average person doesn't have any idea how kind of pointless it is to ask ChatGPT some factual question or something, which I know a lot of people, like my friends, are doing this all the time, right? Instead of just querying Google. And the reasons for that are worth investigating as well. I mean, there's definitely going to be like an incentive for the companies that are making these to get people to want to use them and stuff. And if you knew that it was so much more environmentally deleterious to put that query in, Copilot or whatever, maybe you wouldn't default to that technology.
I think we have one question here.
Thanks for this panel. I'm also thinking a lot about AI these days. I teach writing. I teach writing to graduate students, and so that's my context. And one of the harms that worries me is speed, just speed. And I'm influenced in this worry by the thoughts of Ursula Franklin, who taught us that speed is a production mentality. It's a production attribute. The reason for doing things faster and cheaper is so factory owners can make more money. Not everybody. The benefits don't go to everybody. And as I work with my students, I'm often noting that they're mistaking speed for the goal, that efficiency is better than learning. So, for example, a student asked me, how do I use ChatGPT to write a lit review? But the necessary difficulty, and this relates to the question about the clinical note-taking. I'm not worried about the people who are already really expert and know their field well and can understand the difference between a poor result and a good one. I'm concerned about the students who are feeling vulnerable, who feel like the only way they can catch up is to use ChatGPT. But my concern is that it's faster than human beings can process. It produces way more at a much higher speed than we can process, than we can legislate, than we can develop policies. We will never keep up with it. And so it can make changes before people have any opportunity to absorb and have input. So my question is there pushback anywhere to say, are we just accepting that faster is better for everything? Or are there platforms, opportunities to say, where is slow better? Where is cognitive? It's almost like effort is bad. So if we can reduce effort, but some of that effort is beneficial. Some of it is essential, I believe, for the development of genuine expertise. So I just wondered if you could reflect on whether there are opportunities to push back against speed as the ultimate good.
I mean, I think that's a difficult question. I definitely know of particularly ethicists who have written about sort of the opposite of the move fast and break things attitude of like Silicon Valley, right? I feel like there's even a title like Move Slow and Try Not to Break Things out there. There definitely is a sentiment, particularly in like the ethics of AI, that we should slow down and start thinking more carefully about these things and think about them more carefully before we deploy them into the wider world. Sort of like secondarily to that, a lot of the time the problems that we encounter are only encountered upon releasing these things into the world, right? Like, I don't think Microsoft expected their little chatbot Tay to immediately become like a neo-Nazi. I don't know if some of you have heard about this. I think it was in like 2015 or something. They released this chatbot onto Twitter, and it just immediately sort of absorbed all of this like terrible crap, and it influenced how it behaved, and it ended up being really sort of offensive and had to be deactivated quickly. And so the move fast and break things attitude, I mean, yeah, there's obviously pushback, but then there's also this issue of maybe we can't encounter the problems until they're like at scale, until they're out there. And that's just, so far, that's not inevitably the case, but that has definitely been at least the practical reality for us. And yeah, I think that's unfortunate. But you also mentioned sort of the micro scale of this, like with individual students, and I think there's an interesting dissertation perhaps to be written about that. Some PhD student should write something about the reorientation maybe of our goals from having these cognitive skills to just completing tasks faster. Maybe we're becoming more like computers or something.
I think your job is very hard. I mean, that just sounds incredibly hard. I mean, I like to tell all my students, I'm a huge fan of this book called Do Nothing, which is the exact opposite of speed as a kind of like a virtue, that a lot of my data science or computer science students seem to have. I say that, there's another book that I read recently called Slow Productivity by Cal Newport. Fantastic book, which is all about why are we doing this, right? Can we do less number of things? But I think that kind of goes into where students find themselves right now in terms of, thinking about uncertain job markets and other such things. And so that kind of leads them down paths around how to optimize, grades and all that stuff. So I feel we're running into this fundamental issue of where students find themselves, and then they scramble towards technology that can like erase some of that initial, startup cognitive labor that is inherent in writing anything. So.
People talk about AI and writing, but writing isn't one thing. It's 100 things. Writing a phone number and writing a PhD dissertation is not the same job. A term I've heard recently more frequently is catastrophic failure. That when people use AI to skip all the steps. So don't read the book, don't read the article, summarize the article, and then you can get the paper in for this term, and you can get the lit review in for next term, and you can get a degree faster. And then you go to the job interview and people ask you questions, and you can't compete with experts who can have a really deep, informed conversation, who are deeply aware of what's happening in the field. So if your goal is to submit a document at the end of the term, that's a different goal than being an expert and feeling confident in your expertise, feeling you can participate in a discourse community that you really want to be part of. And so, back to that concern about the fact that students, in the rush to accepting speed as the ultimate good, I don't always think they know what they're giving up.
Regarding the intellectual property and the use of AI at the University of Toronto. I'm U of T alumna, and I was wondering about the differences of the in the use of AI in the undergraduate classroom versus the use of AI in graduate classroom. For example, in the States, there are universities which are strongly opposed to the use of AI. For instance, Vanderbilt University versus Berkeley, for example, which is opening up to the use of AI. So I was just wondering about the U of T policy in this regard, because while U of T students, for example, I taught at U of T undergraduate courses, I can understand the use of AI in undergraduate courses where students are more inclined to reproduce knowledge, to kind of show that they understood information. But in graduate courses, the imperative is original thinking, creativity. Not to talk about what a colleague just said about the doctoral dissertations, where originality is everything. So I don't want to sound in Umberto Eco's terms as apocalyptic, or being apocalyptic about the use of AI, no. But I'm just wondering about this direction where we are heading in terms of graduate studies, especially humanities, where it should be something that should be cherished. Also, maybe, I know I might be asking too many questions. I don't know how the use of ATS logarithms in job search is classified. Is it some sort of AI or just a tool? Because, for example, I was on both sides of the fence, like I was being hired. There is a tendency to use these ATS where you have thousands of applications, and they tailor, there is a huge business in job market, basically writing resumes. As a colleague of mine just mentioned, you have excellent, for example, not just essays, excellent resumes and cover letters. You interview that person and she or he is having a problem to put two sentences together. It was actually immaculate what you read. So there is this obviously use and abuse of AI. So I was just wondering about your thoughts of this, because, and whether it would be classified at all as AI, these logarithms. LinkedIn, I can go on and on, where they don't make any sense. They match me, for example, with certain languages that I'm trilingual, but certain languages I don't speak. Thank you, sorry.
No worries. I can probably answer the first part better. So thus far, things like generative AI or large language models have been used for knowledge reproduction or summarization, which is more a mapping with undergraduate students, as you pointed out. But actually, the most optimistic research about large language models, etc., is towards actually figuring out, given the current information, can large language models actually provide new pathways of research, or can they actually come up with new research themselves? I don't know if anyone in this audience has looked at that, but there's a new product called Notebook LM. Notebook LM. The whole point of Notebook LM is if you upload a whole bunch of scientific papers from, let's say, a research area, it's going to summarize and point you in like a novel direction. Given the scientific papers that you put in, it's going to summarize and point you in a direction that apparently just reading, summarizing the current literature, it can tell you what to do, where the next steps are. So that's actually these are products that are actually in development. Notebook LM has been released. Anybody can play around with it. And it's interesting, right? Like I've played around with it and I've made it hallucinate because, I know what to do. But it's like, I can totally see graduate students, like master's students who are doing their thesis and they want a particular direction and their advisor hasn't told them what to do, and so they would probably do something like that. That world is inevitable, right? And then the second part is that, yes, in hiring systems, automated decision systems that's part of this nebulous definition of AI. In fact, part of the only regulation that exists in the United States is around hiring algorithms, hiring automated decision systems in hiring, because hiring is specifically related to the Civil Rights Act in the US with respect to protected categories protected during hiring. So that is actually one of the very few things that is regulated, and there have been quite a few legal cases in the States. I'm not that clear with the Canadian case law, but the American case law, certainly, people have audited popular hiring automated decision-making systems and have figured out how they're biased. And then, like Amazon was compelled to shut down their automated decision hiring algorithm because it was clearly very sexist, and there was an independent audit done by folks from, I'm going to say, Stanford and Carnegie Mellon and many other folks, who then figured out that yes, they clearly showed that it's extremely biased against women, so they were compelled to shut that down.
Okay, well, I think we're nearing the end of the session, so I want to thank everyone. I want to thank our panelists for coming here. I want to thank you, Kaushar, and I want to thank the audience for their insightful questions. Thank you.
I have been in a panel where we did.